The VA hospital cafeteria buzzed with its usual afternoon activity when 22-year-old Marine Corporal Jake Mitchell spotted the old man sitting alone at a corner table. The elderly gentleman wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, but something about his posture caught Jake's attention. Despite his age, the man sat with military precision, shoulders back, spine straight. Jake had been visiting the hospital for his own appointments following his recent return from Afghanistan. The shrapnel wounds on his left leg were healing well, but the doctors insisted on regular checkups. Today's visit had gone smoothly, and he'd decided to grab lunch before heading home to his small apartment off base. As Jake moved through the cafeteria line, he couldn't help but notice the old man's hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Even from a distance, he could see the intricate pattern of scars covering the weathered fingers and extending up both forearms. These weren't ordinary scars from accidents or medical procedures. Jake recognized the telltale signs of combat injuries, having seen similar marks on fellow Marines who'd survived IED explosions and firefights. The young Marine felt drawn to the stranger. Something about the man's quiet dignity reminded him of his grandfather, who had passed away when Jake was just 15. His grandfather had served in Korea but rarely spoke about his experiences. Jake had always regretted not asking more questions before it was too late. After paying for his sandwich and coffee, Jake approached the old man's table. The stranger looked up with clear blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. His face bore its own collection of faded scars, including a particularly prominent one that ran from his left temple down to his jawline. "Excuse me, sir," Jake said respectfully, standing at attention despite being in civilian clothes. "Would you mind if I joined you? I'm Jake Mitchell, Marine Corps." The old man's expression softened slightly, and he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Frank Thompson," he replied, extending his scarred hand. "Please, sit down, son." As Jake settled into his chair, he found himself studying Frank's scars more closely. They told a story of survival against incredible odds. Some appeared to be from burns, others from cuts or shrapnel. The pattern suggested multiple incidents over time, not just one catastrophic event. Frank noticed Jake's attention and chuckled softly. "You're wondering about these old marks, aren't you?" Jake felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to stare. It's just that I've seen combat myself, and I recognize the signs of someone who's been through hell and back." "Afghanistan?" Frank asked, nodding toward Jake's slight limp as he'd walked over. "Yes, sir. 2 tours. Got hit by an IED on my second deployment. Nothing too serious, thankfully." Jake paused, then couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. "If you don't mind me asking, sir, why so many scars? I've served with guys who've been in intense combat, but I've never seen anything quite like that." Quote, the question hung in the air between them. Frank took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes growing distant as if he were looking back through the years. The cafeteria noise seemed to fade around their table as other conversations continued, but Jake felt as though he and Frank were in their own private bubble. Frank set down his coffee cup and looked directly at Jake. "That's quite a story, son. Are you sure you have the time to hear it?" "No," Jake nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. I've got nowhere to be today." What Jake didn't realize was that their conversation had begun to attract attention from nearby tables. A few other veterans, both young and old, had unconsciously turned their chairs slightly toward the pair. The hospital staff members who regularly worked with military patients had also begun to take notice of the elderly man with the scarred hands. Frank leaned back in his chair and began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of experience. "I got these scars over the course of 43 years, son. 43 years of serving others when they needed help the most." Jake's eyebrows rose in surprise. 43 years was an unusually long military career, even for someone who'd started very young. But before he could ask for clarification, Frank continued, "I wasn't a soldier, Jake. I was a firefighter." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd automatically assumed Frank was a fellow veteran, given his bearing and the nature of his injuries. But as Frank began to explain, a different picture emerged entirely. I started with the Chicago Fire Department in 1962, when I was just 19 years old, fresh out of high school, strong as an ox, and convinced I could save the world. Frank's weathered face cracked into a slight smile at the memory. I had no idea what I was signing up for. Jake listened intently as Frank described his early days as a rookie firefighter. The older man's voice took on a storytelling quality that drew in everyone within earshot. Even the hospital staff had slowed their movements to catch pieces of the conversation. The first scar I got was just 3 months into the job, Frank continued, holding up his left hand to show a thin white line across his palm. Apartment building fire on the south side. I grabbed a piece of hot metal with my bare hand, trying to clear an escape route for a family trapped on the 3rd floor. Burned right through my glove. As Frank spoke, Jake began to understand that each scar represented not just an injury, but a life saved, a family reunited, a community protected. This wasn't the story of a warrior in the traditional sense, but of a different kind of hero entirely. The cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter as more people tuned into Frank's words. Hospital workers found reasons to linger nearby, and other patients had stopped their own conversations to listen. There was something magnetic about the way Frank spoke, with quiet authority and genuine humility. But that first scar taught me something important, Frank continued. It taught me that serving others always comes with a price. The question isn't whether you'll get hurt doing this job. The question is whether the lives you save are worth the scars you'll carry. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He thought about his own injuries from Afghanistan, the nightmares that still woke him some nights, the friends he'd lost. He'd always struggled with whether the sacrifices made by him and his fellow Marines had been worthwhile. Here was a man who seemed to have found peace with that question. 43 years. Jake repeated softly. That's an entire lifetime of service. 43 years. 43 years. 43 years. 43 years. 43 years. 43 years. Frank nodded. It was my lifetime, son. And every scar on these old hands represents someone who went home to their family because we were willing to run toward danger when everyone else was running away. The weight of Frank's words settled over the cafeteria like a blanket. Jake realized he was witnessing something special, a moment when wisdom earned through decades of sacrifice was being shared with a new generation. He also understood that he was about to hear stories that would change his perspective on service, sacrifice, and what it truly meant to be a hero. Frank rolled up his sleeves, revealing the full extent of the scarring on his forearms. The pattern was intricate and telling to those who knew what to look for. Jake could see burn marks, cuts from glass, and what appeared to be surgical scars from multiple operations. See this one? Frank pointed to a particularly large scar that wrapped around his right forearm like a bracelet. December 15th, 1967. Warehouse fire downtown. We'd been fighting it for 6 hours when part of the roof collapsed, trapping 4 of my crew members under burning debris. Frank's voice took on the cadence of someone who had told this story before, but the emotion remained fresh despite the decades that had passed. The cafeteria was now completely silent, except for his words. I crawled under that burning beam to pull them out, one by one. The metal was so hot it melted right through my coat and into my skin. But all 4 of those men went home to their families that Christmas. An elderly woman at the next table had tears streaming down her face. She'd been visiting her husband, a Vietnam veteran, and something about Frank's matter-of-fact heroism had touched her deeply. Jake leaned forward, completely absorbed. How did you keep going back in? The pain must have been incredible. Pain is temporary, son. Regret lasts forever. Frank's blue eyes fixed on Jake's. I learned that lesson early in my career. You can live with burns and cuts and broken bones. What you can't live with is knowing you could have saved someone and chose not to try. Frank shifted in his chair and pointed to a cluster of scars on his left hand. These beauties came from the Martin Luther King riots in 1968, fires everywhere, people trapped in buildings, smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We worked for 72 hours straight. He paused to take another sip of coffee, and Jake noticed that Frank's hands trembled slightly. Whether from age or the memories, Jake couldn't tell. There was this little girl, couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She was on the 4th floor of a tenement building, and the stairs had already collapsed. The only way to reach her was through a window, but the fire escape had been damaged by rioters earlier that week. Frank's voice grew softer, more introspective. I climbed up the side of that building using nothing but window ledges and broken bricks. Cut my hands to ribbons. But I got her down. Her name was Sarah. She's a grandmother now, lives in California, still sends me Christmas cards. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. He thought about the children he'd seen in Afghanistan. Innocent victims caught in circumstances beyond their control. The idea that Frank had carried decades of such rescues, each one carved into his flesh as a permanent reminder, was overwhelming. The worst scars, Frank continued, touching the prominent mark on his face, came from the Our Lady of Angels school fire in 1958, right before I joined the department. I was just a civilian then, but I lived nearby and heard the sirens. The mention of the school fire caused several people in the cafeteria to look up sharply. It had been one of Chicago's most devastating tragedies, claiming 92 lives, most of them children. I wasn't supposed to go into that building. The fire department tried to keep civilians back, but I could hear kids screaming from the 2nd floor. A nun was at one of the windows, holding children, preparing to drop them to the crowd below. Frank's hand unconsciously moved to his face, tracing the long scar. A beam fell just as I was helping her pass children through the window, caught me right across the face, knocked me unconscious. When I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, the first thing I asked was whether we'd gotten all the kids out of that room. "Did you?" Jake asked quietly. Frank's smile was both proud and heartbreaking. "Every single one from that classroom. Sister Margaret and all 12 of her students made it out alive. That's when I knew what I wanted to do with my life." A doctor who had been pretending to read charts at a nearby table finally approached. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. Frank looked up, surprised. "I was, yes. Retired in 2005. "Do we know each other?" The doctor's eyes filled with tears. "You saved my brother in 1983, apartment fire on North Clark Street. I was just 7 years old. But I remember you carrying him out. He was unconscious from smoke inhalation. And the paramedics said another few minutes, and he would have been gone." Frank studied her face carefully, then smiled. "Little Maria Rodriguez. Your brother was Danny, right? How is he?" "He's a fire chief now in Milwaukee, has 3 kids, and always talks about the firefighter who saved his life." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He named his oldest son Frank." The emotional weight of the moment settled over everyone in the cafeteria. Here was living proof of the ripple effects of Frank's sacrifices. Lives saved had gone on to create families, contribute to society, and save others in turn. Jake was struggling to process everything he was hearing. As a Marine, he'd been trained to think of heroism in terms of battlefield courage and military valor. But Frank's quiet, decades-long dedication to protecting civilians represented a different kind of heroism entirely. "How many people do you think you saved over the years?" Jake asked. Frank shrugged, genuinely uncomfortable with the question. "I never kept count, son. That wasn't the point. The point was showing up every time the bell rang, giving everything you had, and trusting that your training and your team would see you through." "But the scars," Jake persisted. "Each one represents someone who went home because you were willing to get hurt. Each one represents a family that stayed together," Frank corrected gently. "A child who got to grow up with their parents, a spouse who didn't become a widow, grandparents who lived to see their grandchildren born." As Frank continued sharing his stories, the crowd around them continued to grow. Hospital staff, patients, and visitors had formed an informal circle around their table. Each scar Frank displayed came with a story of selflessness, of split-second decisions made in impossible circumstances, of a man who had chosen again and again to risk his own safety for strangers. The burn scars on his neck came from a chemical plant explosion in 1975. The surgical scar on his wrist was from when he'd been crushed under a collapsed wall while rescuing an elderly man from a house fire in 1991. The small puncture wounds on his forearm were from crawling through broken glass to reach a car accident victim in 1988. Each story was told with the same matter-of-fact tone, as if risking his life for others had been as natural as breathing. Frank never portrayed himself as heroic or special. To him, he'd simply been doing his job, fulfilling a commitment he'd made as a young man to serve his community. The hardest part, Frank admitted as he finished describing a particularly dangerous rescue from a high-rise fire in the 1990 seconds, wasn't the physical pain. It was the times we couldn't save everyone. Those haunt you more than any burn or cut ever could. Jake nodded, understanding completely. Every soldier carried the weight of those they couldn't save, the missions that went wrong, the split-second decisions that replayed endlessly in quiet moments. But you kept going back, Jake observed. Every single day for 43 years, Frank confirmed. Because for every life we lost, there were dozens we saved. And those families deserved someone willing to fight for them. As Frank finished his last story, a profound silence settled over the cafeteria. Jake looked around and realized that nearly 30 people had gathered to listen. Hospital workers stood with forgotten tasks, patients had abandoned their meals, and even the usually bustling kitchen staff had quieted their activities. The silence wasn't uncomfortable or awkward. It was the kind of reverent quiet that falls when people encounter something sacred, something that transcends ordinary conversation. Every person in that room understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Frank seemed genuinely surprised by the attention his stories had attracted. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, many of them showing tears, others displaying expressions of awe and respect. This humble man, who had simply been sharing his experiences with a young Marine, had inadvertently created a moment that would stay with everyone present for the rest of their lives. Jake was the first to break the silence. His voice came out rougher than intended, thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. Mr. Thompson, I asked you about your scars because I thought I understood what service meant. I've been to war, I've seen combat, I've been wounded in defense of my country. He paused, struggling to find the right words. But listening to you, I realized that there are different kinds of courage, different ways to serve. What you did, running into burning buildings day after day for over 4 decades, saving people you'd never met and would never see again. That's a kind of heroism I never fully understood. Frank reached across the table and placed his scarred hand over Jake's. Son, what you did in Afghanistan, protecting this country and its values, that takes just as much courage. We all serve in different ways, but the heart of it is the same. We put others before ourselves. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward from the crowd. Mr. Thompson, my brother wanted me to tell you something if I ever met you. He said that you didn't just save his life that night in 1983, you saved our entire family. My parents never recovered from the fear of losing a child, but they also never forgot the gratitude they felt toward you and all firefighters. An elderly man in a hospital gown shuffled forward, supported by a walker. You probably don't remember me, he said in a shaky voice. But you pulled me from a car wreck in 1979. Highway 94, during that terrible ice storm. I was trapped for 3 hours before you and your crew arrived. Frank studied the man's face. Then his expression brightened with recognition. Harold Peterson. You had a compound fracture in your left leg, and you kept asking about your briefcase. Harold laughed through his tears. You remember. You stayed with me the entire time the paramedics worked to free me from the wreckage. Kept telling me jokes to keep me conscious. That briefcase had pictures of my newborn daughter in it. How is she? Frank asked with genuine interest. She's a trauma surgeon now. Works right here at this hospital. Says she became a doctor because she wanted to save lives the way you saved her father. The stories continued as more people stepped forward. A middle-aged woman, whose house Frank had saved from a gas explosion in the 1970 seconds. A man whose father had been rescued from a factory fire in the 1980 seconds. a teenager whose grandmother had survived a nursing home evacuation that Frank had coordinated during a flood in the 1,990 seconds. Each person carried with them not just their own gratitude, but the gratitude of families, children, and grandchildren whose lives had been forever changed by Frank's willingness to risk everything for strangers. Jake sat in amazement as he watched this impromptu reunion unfold. Frank had not sought recognition or praise. He had simply been sharing his experiences with a fellow service member. But his stories had created ripples that touched everyone in the room. "This is incredible," Jake whispered to Frank during a brief lull in the testimonials. Frank shook his head in wonder. "I had no idea. You spend your career focused on the job in front of you. The next call. The next emergency. You don't really think about the long-term impact." A hospital administrator had appeared, drawn by the unusual gathering in the cafeteria. She listened quietly as the stories continued, then approached Frank with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Sarah Williams, the director of this hospital. I've been listening to these stories, and I think everyone in this room would agree that we're in the presence of someone very special." Frank started to protest, but she held up a hand to stop him. "You've inspired something here today that I've never seen before. People are sharing stories of hope, of courage, of the difference one person can make. Would you be willing to share your story with our support groups? Our veterans therapy sessions? We have so many patients who are struggling with feelings of purposelessness, who don't understand the value of their own service." Frank looked around the room at all the faces looking back at him expectantly. Jake could see him wrestling with the decision. This was clearly not something he'd ever considered doing. "I don't know," Frank said slowly. "I'm not a speaker. I'm just a retired firefighter." "That's exactly why your story is so powerful, Doctor," Rodriguez interjected. "You're proof that heroes don't wear capes or seek glory. They just show up and do what needs to be done. Day after day. Year after year." Jake leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, you've given me a new perspective on what it means to serve. There are probably hundreds of veterans in this hospital who could benefit from hearing that they're not the only ones carrying scars, that their service mattered, that there are different ways to measure the value of a life spent helping others." The room fell silent again, as everyone waited for Frank's response. Jake could see the internal struggle on the old firefighter's face. Here was a man who had spent his entire career deflecting praise, focusing on the job rather than personal recognition. Finally, Frank nodded slowly. "If you think it might help someone, then I suppose I could try." The eruption of applause that followed was immediate and heartfelt. Hospital workers, patients, and visitors all showed their approval. But more than that, their gratitude for Frank's willingness to continue serving even in retirement. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Frank individually to shake his hand, share their contact information, or simply to say thank you. Jake remained seated, still processing everything he had witnessed. When the last person had left their table, Frank turned to Jake. "Well, son, that wasn't quite what I expected when I sat down for lunch today." Jake laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Mr. Thompson, when I asked you about your scars, I was thinking about my own injuries, wondering if the pain I went through was worth it. You've answered that question in a way I never expected. How's that? You've shown me that our scars aren't just reminders of pain we've endured. They're proof of love we've shown, evidence that we were willing to sacrifice our own comfort, our own safety, for others. Whether it's running into a burning building or serving in combat, the willingness to put others first is what makes the pain worthwhile." Frank smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with warmth. "That's beautifully put, Jake, and you're right. These scars tell the story of a life spent loving people I'd never met, protecting families I'd never see again. When you look at it that way, they're not ugly marks of damage, they're proof of purpose." As they finally stood to leave, Jake realized that his own perspective on his injuries had fundamentally shifted. The shrapnel scars on his leg, the nightmares from Afghanistan, the weight of memories he carried, all of it had new meaning now. Frank had shown him that heroism isn't about seeking glory or recognition. It's about showing up consistently, day after day. When others need help, it's about being willing to carry scars so that others don't have to carry the weight of loss. The two men exchanged contact information, and Frank promised to call Jake when he scheduled his first speaking engagement. As they parted ways in the hospital parking lot, Jake felt like he was saying goodbye to more than just a new friend. He was saying goodbye to an old version of himself, one that had questioned whether his service mattered. Frank Thompson, with his scarred hands and humble demeanor, had silenced an entire room, not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with simple truths about love, service, and the courage to help others. His answer to a young Marine's question had transformed not just Jake's understanding, but the perspective of everyone who heard his story. In the days that followed, word of Frank's impromptu storytelling sessions spread throughout the hospital and beyond. The veteran who had spent 43 years saving lives had inadvertently begun a new chapter of service, helping heal the invisible wounds carried by those who had dedicated their lives to protecting others. And every time Frank looked at his scarred hands, he would remember not just the fires he had fought, but the room full of people whose lives had been touched by his willingness to run toward danger when others ran away.